The real story of Billy the Kid, the boy every Wild West lawman feared. It is past midnight in a darkened bedroom at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. The 14th of July, 1881. A man sits against the wall in the black, a revolver in his hand, barely breathing. Out on the porch, boots scrape the boards. A young man steps through the open door and stops cold because he can feel that he is not alone, and he asks softly, in Spanish, "Who is there?" 2 shots tear the dark apart. The most wanted man in the Wild West is dead on the floor at 21 years old, killed by a man who had once ridden beside him. And everything you think you know about that young man named Billy the Kid began with a promise a governor made and then broke. And this does not end the way the movies told you. Subscribe and hit like right now, or the algorithm will bury the rest of this before you ever see it. Here is the whole of it in 2 lines, so you have the stakes before we go back to the beginning. This is the story of how an abandoned orphan became the most feared name on the frontier, was sworn in as an officer of the law, was promised his freedom by the governor of the territory, and was hunted down and shot in the dark at 21. And the thing the legend hides is that the law did not chase him because he was born dangerous. The law made him, used him, and then threw him away. He was born Henry McCarty, most likely in 1859, probably in New York City, though the records are so thin that even the year and the place are still argued over. His family was poor and Irish, part of the great wave that came through the eastern slums and then kept moving, looking for somewhere the next year might be better. They drifted west across the country, through Indianapolis, through Wichita in Kansas, and finally down into the dry mining town of Silver City in the New Mexico Territory. They went there partly for the air, because his mother, Catherine, was sick. She had tuberculosis, the slow killer of the century, and in September of 1874 it took her. Henry was about 14. His stepfather, a drifter named William Antrim, was a man who chased silver veins, not children. Within a short time he was gone to the mines and the boy was on his own. Picture what that meant. No mother, no father, no money, no trade. In a rough camp where a child without protection was simply prey. He boarded where he could, washed dishes, ran errands. And then, at around 15, he was arrested for the first time. The charge was small. He had helped hide a bundle of clothes stolen from a local laundry. It was a boy's crime, the kind that earns a scolding. But he was locked in the Silver City jail to wait, and the boy did something that tells you exactly who he already was. He went up the chimney. He climbed the inside of the jail chimney, squeezed out at the top, and vanished. He was not a killer yet. He was a frightened teenager who had learned one lesson the West taught the poor very well. No one is coming to save you. Run. He ran into Arizona. He took work as a ranch hand and a camp cook, and he fell in with gamblers and horse thieves, because those were the men who would have him. And then came the day that cut his old life off for good. At a settlement near Camp Grant in August of 1877, a blacksmith named Frank Cahill, a big man who liked to push the slight teenager around, threw him to the ground and pinned him. The records suggest it was Cahill on top beating him, and the boy got a pistol free and fired. Cahill died the next day. Now, the legend will tell you this was the first notch on a killer's gun. The evidence tells you something closer to a cornered 17-year-old who shot a man who was hurting him. Either way, it did not matter to the law. He was charged, and he ran again, back across the line into New Mexico, under a new name, William H. Bonney. The kid, by 17, he had no home, no family, and no law on his side, and he rode straight into a county that was about to go to war. Now, here is where almost everyone gets the story wrong. They think the Lincoln County War was about gunfighters and grudges. It was not. It was about a store. Lincoln County in 1877 was one of the largest counties in the United States, a vast empty stretch of New Mexico, and almost everything in it ran through a single business. People called it simply the house. It was owned by an Irish former soldier named Lawrence Murphy and his hard young partner, James Dolan. And the house did not just sell goods. It owned the county. If you were a small rancher or a farmer, you bought your flour and your tools from the house on credit, at the house's prices, and you sold your cattle to the house at the house's prices. And the real money was bigger than any store. The federal government needed beef and grain to feed the soldiers at Fort Stanton, and the Mescalero Apache held on the reservation, and those government contracts went to the house. Control the only store and the only contracts. And you control every dollar in a territory the size of a small country. Into that closed system walked a young Englishman named John Tunstall. He was educated, ambitious, and he had family money. And he looked at Lincoln County and saw an opening. In 1877, he opened a rival store, a bank, and a ranch, and he partnered with a clever lawyer named Alexander McSween and drew the backing of the most powerful cattleman in the region, John Chisholm. The message was plain. The monopoly was over, and on Tunstall's ranch, riding as a hired hand and guarding his cattle, was the teenage William Bonney. For the first time since his mother died, someone treated the boy like he was worth something. Tunstall, by every account, was decent to him. That mattered more than anyone watching could have guessed. The house did not answer with lower prices. It answered the way monopolies answer when the law belongs to them. On the 18th of February 1878, a posse rode out, supposedly to seize Tunstall's horses over a disputed debt. They caught the Englishman alone on the trail. They shot him, and the accounts say they shot him again as he lay there, and then arranged his body and his rifle to make it look like a fight. Tunstall was unarmed in any real sense. He was simply murdered. And here is the part the films skip. The men who killed him were riding under the authority of the county sheriff, William Brady, and Brady was a houseman through and through. So the boy watched the one man who had ever protected him gunned down, and he watched the law smile and call it legal. He rode out for revenge. But he did not ride out as an outlaw. He rode out with a warrant, and the question that drives the rest of this story is how a hunted teenager ended up carrying a badge. The answer is that in Lincoln County, the law was not a wall between order and chaos. It was a weapon. And right then there were two sets of hands reaching for it. The Tunstall side went to the only friendly official they could find, a justice of the peace named John Wilson, and they had themselves legally deputized. They called themselves the Regulators. On paper, they were a constable's posse, sworn officers carrying legitimate arrest warrants for Tunstall's killers. In practice, they were a war party, and the most committed fighter among them was the 18-year-old Bonney. Ride that again. The future most wanted outlaw in the West was, for a stretch in 1878, an officer of the law with a warrant in his pocket. That is not a movie invention. That is the record. The Regulators went hunting. They caught two men they believed had been in the posse that killed Tunstall, and those two men died in their custody, shot while supposedly trying to escape. The line between justice and murder, never thick out there, was gone. Then they went for the sheriff himself. On the 1st of April 1878, Sheriff William Brady and his deputies were walking down the single main street of the town of Lincoln when the Regulators opened fire from behind an adobe wall. Brady went down dead. A deputy named George Hindman died with him. Bonney was one of the guns behind that wall, and he was wounded darting out into the street afterward. That ambush is what would one day put a noose around his neck, because killing a sheriff is the one crime the territory could not let slide, no matter who the sheriff had served. The war kept escalating, and it kept costing. At a place called Blazer's Mills, the Regulators tried to take a tough lone gunman named Buckshot Roberts, and the fight cost the life of their own leader, Dick Brewer, Tunstall's former foreman, the man holding the whole posse together. The killing was no longer settling anything. It was just feeding itself. And it all came to a head in July of 1878, in the streets of Lincoln, in what people came to call the 5-day battle. The Regulators and McSween barricaded themselves in McSween's house. The housemen surrounded them. For 5 days, the town was a shooting gallery. And then the thing happened that proved, once and for all, whose side the system was on. The commander at nearby Fort Stanton, a colonel named Nathan Dudley, marched his soldiers into town with a cannon, and though he claimed to be neutral, he pointed his strength at the Regulators and stood aside while the housemen set McSween's house on fire. As the flames spread, the men inside had to break out into the gunfire. Alexander McSween, the lawyer, who had started it all by daring to compete, was shot down in his own burning yard. Bonney ran straight through the bullets and out into the dark, and he lived. Understand what he had just seen with his own eyes. Both sides had badges. The army itself had picked a winner. Out here, the law was simply a thing you could buy, and the side with the most money had bought it. The war was over. The house had won. And for the boy who had survived it, there looked to be only one clean way out. A deal made with the highest authority in the territory itself. That authority was the new governor of New Mexico, a man named Lew Wallace. And here is one of the strangest facts in the whole American frontier. While Lew Wallace was governing this bloody little corner of the West and trying to put down its war, he was sitting up at night writing a novel. That novel was Ben-Hur, the story of revenge and forgiveness in the ancient world that would become one of the best-selling books of the century. The man holding the pen that wrote about mercy was about to show a real young man exactly how much his word was worth. Wallace wanted the violence to stop, and he needed convictions. In the spring of 1879, Bonnie happened to witness the murder of a lawyer named Houston Chapman, gunned down in the street by men tied to the house. The young man had something the governor wanted, eyewitness testimony. So the two of them met in secret at night in the town of Lincoln. The deal was simple and, on its face, fair. Bonnie would let himself be arrested. He would testify before the grand jury about the killings he had seen, and in exchange Governor Wallace would give him a pardon, a clean slate, a way to walk out of the fire and start over as a free man, still only 19 years old. The young man kept his side. He submitted to a staged arrest, he sat in jail, and he testified, he named names. And then he waited for the pardon. It never came. The district attorney handling the cases, a man named William Reinerson, was tied to the House faction, and he had no intention of letting the murder charge against Bonnie for killing Sheriff Brady simply disappear. The governor, his usefulness from the boy already spent, did nothing. He did not fight for the pardon. He did not free him. He moved on, and soon enough he moved away, off to write more of his famous book and on to other posts. The promise was just gone. The way Tunstall was gone. The way his mother was gone. He had trusted the law one last time, and the law had used him and walked away. So he did the only thing he had ever known how to do when the world closed on him. He left, he drifted back to the open country around Fort Sumner, and he went back to stealing cattle to live. But the territory had decided it wanted him finished. And it found the perfect man to do it. Lincoln County elected a new sheriff, a tall, quiet former buffalo hunter and bartender named Pat Garrett, who had known Bonnie around the Fort Sumner saloons. The legend likes to say they were close friends, and the truth is probably more that they were acquaintances who had drunk and gambled in the same rooms. It hardly mattered now. Garrett had a badge and a mandate, and he hunted the young man through the winter snow with a cold patience. In December of 1880, Garrett's posse cornered the gang. One of Bonnie's closest companions was shot dead in the dark outside Fort Sumner, and a few days later, at a stone hut at a place called Stinking Springs, Garrett killed another and starved the rest out. The kid surrendered. They took him in chains to the town of Mesilla and put him on trial, and of all the killings in all that war, the charge they convicted him of was the murder of Sheriff William Brady on that April Street. The sentence was death by hanging. He was the only man any side of the entire Lincoln County war to be convicted of anything. They sent him back to Lincoln to hang, and they held him on the upper floor of the very courthouse that had once been the house's store, the building at the heart of everything. 2 guards watched him. And on the 28th of April, 1881, he made his last and most famous escape. How exactly he slipped his handcuffs is still debated, but he got hold of a gun, and when it was over, both guards, James Bell and Robert Olinger, were dead, and the condemned man rode out of town in front of half the population, free again. He was 21 years old, and he had less than 3 months left to live. Which brings us back to the dark bedroom. Garrett heard the kid was lingering around Fort Sumner, unwilling or unable to leave the country and the people he knew. And that was the mistake that killed him. On the night of the 14th of July, 1881, Garrett came to question a rancher named Pete Maxwell and sat down on the edge of Maxwell's bed in the unlit room to talk. And in walked the young man, by pure chance, carrying a knife, looking for something to eat. He sensed someone there in the black and asked the question that became the last thing he ever said. In Spanish, "Who is it?" Garrett fired twice. 1 bullet found the heart. The boy who had survived a war, a betrayal, a death sentence, and a courthouse full of guards died on the floor in seconds, in the dark, at 21. And then the strangest part of the whole story began, because the dying was where the legend started growing. Pat Garrett, the man who had killed him, put his name on a book about him the very next year, a wildly embroidered account ghostwritten by a newspaperman, and the cheap dime novels of the East took the rest and ran. The hungry, abandoned teenager became a grinning demon who had killed 21 men, 1 for every year of his life. That number is almost certainly a myth. When historians strip the story down to what the records will actually carry, the count of men he killed by his own hand alone comes to maybe 4, with a few more in the chaos of group fights, perhaps 9 in all if you are generous. Most of them inside a war the law itself had started. The famous image of him firing left-handed, the gunfighter who drew with the wrong hand, came from a single surviving tintype photograph, and the image is simply reversed. The way that kind of photograph reverses everything, so his holster only looks like it is on the wrong side. He was right-handed. And that one small, blurry picture of a slight young man in a battered hat, the only authenticated photo of him that exists, sold at auction in 2011 for more than $2 million. The boy who died with almost nothing became, in death, one of the most valuable faces in American history. So strip the dime novels away and look at what is actually there. A poor immigrant child, orphaned and abandoned in a mining camp, who was decent enough to be loved by the one good man who hired him, and who learned in the cruelest school there is that the law was not a shield but a thing the rich could rent. He was sworn in